The morning mist clung to the glassy surface of Crystal Lake, shrouding the world in a soft, gray veil as birds sang their gentle dawn chorus. On the edge of the lake, nestled among towering pines and dense underbrush, sat a small, weathered cabin. Its cedar siding, worn smooth by decades of wind and rain, gave it a humble, lived-in charm that perfectly reflected its owner, Emma Holloway. Emma, a spry 63-year-old with a head of thick, silver hair and the kind of weathered hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work, sat on her cabin's creaking front porch, a steaming cup of black coffee in her hand. She watched as the sun slowly burned away the morning fog, revealing the sparkling waters of the lake below. It was her morning ritual, one she had cherished for decades. To the few neighbors who passed by on their morning jogs or kayak outings, Emma was just the quiet woman who lived alone on the hill, the one with the green thumb and the warm, welcoming smile. What they didn't know was that Emma was a retired civil engineer, a woman who had spent her career designing bridges and flood control systems for the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. She had managed massive infrastructure projects, balancing budgets and negotiating with politicians, all while quietly saving her money and investing wisely. When she retired, she bought this cabin as a retreat, a place to unwind and reconnect with the natural world she loved. As she sipped her coffee, Emma's attention was drawn to the distant sound of motors. She squinted through the trees and saw a convoy of black SUVs snaking its way down the narrow gravel road that led to her cabin. Her brow furrowed in confusion. Visitors were rare this deep into the woods, especially this early in the morning. The vehicles pulled up in front of her cabin, their engines rumbling like restless beasts before falling silent. The doors swung open, and a small army of sharply dressed men and women in crisp business suits stepped out, their polished shoes crunching on the gravel driveway. At their head was a tall, thin woman with perfectly styled blonde hair and an air of barely concealed disdain. She was holding a clipboard and barking orders to the others, who scattered like ants, measuring the land and snapping photos with high-end cameras. Emma set her cup down slowly, her heart beginning to pound as a wave of unease washed over her. She rose from her chair, the old boards of the porch creaking beneath her weight, and walked down the steps to meet them. "Morning," she called out, forcing a friendly smile. "Can I help you folks with something?" The blonde woman glanced up from her clipboard, her icy blue eyes narrowing as she took in Emma's worn jeans, flannel shirt, and muddy work boots. She plastered a tight, professional smile on her face as she stepped forward, her hand extended. "Good morning. My name is Victoria Carson, head of the Crystal Lake Homeowners Association. We're here to conduct a property assessment." Emma raised an eyebrow, her hand hanging limply in the air for a moment before she reached out to shake Victoria's icy grip. "Property assessment? I'm not part of the HOA." Victoria's smile tightened, her manicured nails digging into Emma's palm before she released her grip. "Actually, you are. You see, this cabin is located on land that falls within the boundaries of the Crystal Lake community. It's part of our managed area, and as such, you are subject to our rules and regulations." Emma felt a flicker of irritation rise in her chest, but she forced herself to remain calm. "I don't think that's right," she replied, her voice steady. "I've owned this land outright for over 20 years. I bought it from the original owner before the HOA even existed." Victoria's eyes gleamed, the predatory smile of a woman who had heard it all before stretching her thin lips. "I'm afraid you're mistaken. Our records clearly indicate that this parcel is part of the community. As such, you'll need to comply with our guidelines or face potential eviction." Emma felt her pulse quicken, the old, familiar spark of a fight igniting in her chest. She took a slow, steadying breath, forcing herself to remain calm. She had spent her life dealing with bureaucrats and petty tyrants, men and women who used their positions of power to bully and intimidate. She wasn't about to back down now, not on her own land. "Listen, Miss Carson," she said, her voice growing colder, sharper. "I've lived here for over 2 decades. I know every tree, every rock, every inch of this land. I know the loons that nest on the far side of the lake and the family of deer that bed down behind my garden. I know the storm drain I installed to keep this hillside from washing away in the spring, and I know the exact location of the property lines because I had them surveyed myself before I ever broke ground on this cabin. If you're trying to tell me that I'm suddenly part of your HOA, You're going to have a hell of a time convincing me." Victoria's smile faltered for just a moment, a flicker of doubt crossing her perfectly made-up face before she quickly recovered. "Be that as it may," she said, her tone dripping with condescension. "You'll still need to comply with our regulations if you wish to remain in good standing with the community. We'll be in touch." With that, she turned on her heel, her stilettos clicking sharply against the gravel as she strode back to her SUV. Her entourage quickly followed, their cameras flashing as they snapped a few last photos of Emma's cabin before piling back into their vehicles and roaring off down the gravel road. Emma watched them go, her hands clenched into tight fists at her sides. She took a deep, steadying breath, feeling the cool mountain air fill her lungs and clear her mind. She wasn't a woman who scared easily, and she certainly wasn't about to let some overzealous HOA bureaucrat push her off her own land. As the sound of the SUVs faded into the distance, Emma turned and marched back up her porch steps, her mind already racing with plans. If the Crystal Lake HOA wanted a fight, they had just picked the wrong woman to mess with. Emma stepped back into her cabin, the screen door creaking shut behind her. She set her coffee mug down on the chipped countertop, her mind already racing through the possibilities. The HOA's claim couldn't possibly be true. She had bought this land outright, and she had the paperwork to prove it. But if there was one thing Emma had learned during her decades as a civil engineer, it was that bureaucracy had a way of creeping into every corner of life, twisting facts and rewriting history to suit its own needs. She pulled a battered metal filing cabinet away from the wall, her fingers brushing against the cool steel as she unlocked the bottom drawer. Inside, neatly organized in thick, manila folders, were decades' worth of property records, survey maps, tax assessments, and receipts. Emma had always been meticulous, her engineer's mind unwilling to leave anything to chance. She flipped through the files, her hands moving quickly as she searched for the one marked deed and title. She found it near the back, the folder thick with crisp, yellowed pages and faded blueprints. She carried it to the kitchen table, the familiar weight of the papers grounding her as she spread them out before her. The original deed was there, its edges frayed but the text still clear, outlining her rights to the cabin and the surrounding 40 acres. It had been signed by the original owner, a grizzled old trapper named Carl Dawson, who had built the cabin with his bare hands in the 1950s. Emma remembered the day she had bought the place from him, the way his gnarled fingers had trembled as he passed her the keys, his eyes misting over as he said goodbye to the home he had poured his life into. Emma felt a pang of nostalgia, her eyes lingering on the old man's scrawled signature for a moment before she turned her attention to the survey maps. She unrolled one of the larger sheets, its corners curling up from years of being tightly folded. The map showed the boundaries of her property, clearly marked with thick, black lines that stretched from the lakeshore to the tree line at the top of the ridge. There was no mistaking it. Her land extended well beyond the small clearing where her cabin sat, encompassing not just the wooded slopes behind her home, but also a substantial portion of the lakeshore, including the boat dock that Victoria and her crew had so boldly claimed as their own. Emma's heart quickened as she traced the lines with her finger, her pulse pounding in her ears. The dock wasn't just a shared community resource, as the HOA had claimed. It was part of her property, a fact clearly documented in the original deed and survey. She felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face as the realization hit her. Not only did she own her cabin, but she also owned the very dock that the HOA had used as a selling point in their glossy brochures and marketing materials. She could almost hear Carl's raspy chuckle, his voice crackling like dry leaves in her memory. "They think they own the place, but they don't know squat about what's really theirs," he had once told her, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Emma leaned back in her chair, her mind racing with possibilities. She could confront Victoria directly, shove the paperwork in her perfectly made-up face and demand that she back off. But that felt too easy, too direct. No, if Emma was going to play this game, she wanted to make sure the HOA felt every bit of the pressure they had tried to put on her. She wanted to expose their lies, to tear down the carefully constructed facade of control they had built around the lake, and to remind them that even the quietest, most unassuming people can have a spine of steel when pushed too far. She spent the next few days gathering her evidence, poring over tax records, utility bills, and old letters from Carl. She found an old, handwritten note tucked between the pages of one of the folders, its paper thin and brittle with age. It was a rough sketch of the property lines, drawn in Carl's shaky hand, with a short, scrawled message beneath it. Never forget what's yours. They'll try to take it if you let them. Emma felt a swell of fierce pride as she held the note up to the light, the words glowing softly against the sunlit window. She had no intention of letting anyone take what was hers. Not now, not ever. Satisfied that she had gathered everything she needed, Emma loaded the documents into a sturdy leather satchel and drove into town, her old pickup truck rumbling down the gravel road like a bear emerging from hibernation. She pulled into the county courthouse parking lot and climbed the steps to the records office, her boots echoing against the polished marble floor. The clerk behind the counter, a young woman with a bright smile and a name tag that read Megan, looked up as Emma approached. "Morning," Emma said, setting her satchel on the counter with a soft thud. "I need to pull some records." Megan's smile faltered for a moment, her eyes flicking to the heavy bag before she quickly recovered. "Of course, ma'am. What can I help you with?" Emma leaned in, her voice low and steady. "I need copies of every recorded deed, survey, and easement for the properties around Crystal Lake, especially the ones involving the boat dock." Megan's eyes widened, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a moment before she began typing furiously, her cheeks flushing with a mixture of curiosity and nervousness. "That's quite a lot of paperwork, ma'am. It might take a while." Emma smiled, her eyes gleaming with the thrill of the hunt. "That's all right, dear. I've got all day." As the printer behind the counter began to whir to life, spitting out page after page of neatly typed documents, Emma felt the tension in her shoulders begin to ease. She was on the right path, and she knew it. The HOA had tried to push her off her land, had tried to intimidate her into compliance, but they had underestimated her resolve, her tenacity, and her deep, abiding sense of justice. As she gathered the freshly printed documents into her satchel and made her way back to her truck, Emma felt a deep, satisfying warmth spread through her chest. She had the evidence she needed, the proof that the land was hers and hers alone. And as she drove back up the winding mountain road, the sun dipping low behind the pine-covered peaks, she knew that the real fight had only just begun. Emma's old truck bounced and rattled over the gravel road as she made her way back to the cabin, her leather satchel packed with fresh evidence sitting on the passenger seat like a loyal co-pilot. She felt a strange mix of anger and exhilaration, her mind racing with possibilities as she navigated the twisting, tree-lined path. She had spent her career solving complex engineering problems, designing bridges that spanned deep gorges and flood barriers that held back raging rivers. Now, she faced a different kind of challenge, one that required not just technical skill, but cunning and patience. As she pulled into her driveway, the tires crunching over the loose gravel, Emma spotted a small figure waiting on her porch. It was Sam, her closest neighbor, a wiry, gray-bearded man in his 70s who had lived by the lake his entire life. He stood with his hands stuffed into the pockets of his old flannel jacket, his sharp, blue eyes tracking Emma's approach like a hawk watching a field mouse. Emma climbed out of the truck, her boots hitting the ground with a satisfying thud. She grabbed her satchel and made her way up the porch steps, a warm smile spreading across her face as she met Sam's intense gaze. "Morning, Sam," she said, her breath puffing white in the crisp mountain air. "What brings you by?" Sam jerked his head toward the lake, his jaw set in a hard line. "Heard some chatter down at the marina. Word is the HOA's looking to expand their territory, and they've got their sights set on your place." Emma's smile tightened, the familiar flicker of anger sparking in her chest. She set her satchel down on the small, weathered table beside the door and crossed her arms over her chest, leaning back against the cabin wall. "I figured as much. They sent a crew out here the other day, claiming my cabin is part of their community and that I'm subject to their rules." Sam snorted, his breath steaming in the cold air. "Bunch of bullies, the lot of them. Been trying to push people around ever since they put in that fancy new dock and started selling those overpriced lakefront lots. They think they own the place." Emma felt a slow, satisfied smile spread across her face as she reached for her satchel, pulling out the thick stack of papers she had collected at the courthouse. "Well, they're in for a surprise. Turns out, I own not just this cabin, but a good chunk of the lakeshore, too, including their precious dock. Sam's eyes widened, a low, appreciative whistle slipping through his teeth as he leaned in to examine the documents. No kidding? You got the deed to the whole lot. Emma nodded, flipping through the pages until she found the original survey map, the one that clearly marked her property boundaries stretching all the way down to the water's edge. She tapped the map with her finger, her eyes gleaming with a fierce, quiet pride. I had this place surveyed before I bought it. The dock sits squarely on my land, and I've got the paperwork to prove it. Sam let out a deep, rumbling chuckle, his eyes sparkling with a mixture of admiration and delight. Well, I'll be damned. You've got them by the short hairs, don't you? Emma's grin widened as she slipped the papers back into her satchel, her mind already racing with plans. I do. But I'm not just looking to win a skirmish here, Sam. I want to send a message, to make it clear that they can't push people around just because they've got a fancy clubhouse and a stack of bylaws. I want them to feel the pressure, to know what it's like to be backed into a corner. Sam's grin faded slightly, his eyes narrowing as he leaned in closer. You be careful, Emma. Those HOA types can be vicious when they feel threatened. They've got lawyers, connections, money. They'll come at you with everything they've got. Emma's smile hardened, her eyes growing colder as she straightened, pulling her shoulders back and lifting her chin. Let them try. I've dealt with worse bullies in my day. I'm not scared of a few lawyers. Sam's face softened, a flicker of pride and respect flashing in his eyes as he reached out to clap her on the shoulder. That's the spirit, kid. You give him hell. With that, he turned and made his way down the steps, his boots crunching over the gravel as he headed back to his own cabin, his breath steaming in the cold air. Emma watched him go, her heart swelling with a fierce, quiet pride. She had allies, people who would stand with her if things got rough. She wasn't alone in this fight, and that knowledge gave her strength. Over the next few days, Emma set to work, building her case against the HOA piece by piece. She combed through her property records, pulling old tax assessments and utility bills, every scrap of paper that proved her ownership of the land. She found the original building permits for the dock, issued long before the HOA had even existed, and even dug up an old, grainy black and white photo of Carl Dawson, the original owner, standing proudly on the dock with a freshly caught trout dangling from his hand. She copied everything, scanning the documents into her old desktop computer and printing multiple sets just in case. She reached out to a few other longtime residents, sharing her findings and quietly rallying support. She knew that the HOA had been pushing their weight around for years, bullying people into compliance and quietly rewriting the rules to suit their own interests. But now, for the first time, they were facing someone who not only had the knowledge and resources to fight back, but the determination to see it through to the bitter end. Finally, when she felt she had gathered enough evidence to back up her claims, Emma sat down at her kitchen table and began drafting a letter. It was a simple, straightforward document, laying out her legal rights and demanding that the HOA immediately cease and desist their attempts to encroach on her property. She included copies of her deeds, surveys, and tax records, along with a pointed reminder that interfering with her property without her permission could result in serious legal consequences. When she finished, she sealed the letter in a thick, manila envelope, her hands steady and sure as she scrawled the HOA's address across the front in bold, black ink. She leaned back in her chair, a slow, satisfied smile spreading across her face as she imagined the look on Victoria's perfectly made-up face when she opened the envelope and realized just how badly she had miscalculated. As Emma set the envelope aside, ready for the next morning's mail run, she felt a deep, bone-deep satisfaction settle in her chest. She had taken the first step in a long, hard fight, but she felt ready for whatever came next. She had faced far greater challenges in her life, and she had no intention of backing down now. Emma dropped the thick, manila envelope into the blue metal mailbox outside the small general store at the edge of town. The satisfying clunk of the metal door snapping shut echoed in the cold morning air, a sharp, definitive sound that sent a shiver of satisfaction down her spine. It was done. The first shot in her battle against the Crystal Lake HOA had been fired, and there was no turning back now. As she climbed back into her truck, Emma felt a curious mixture of anticipation and calm. She had faced far greater adversaries in her life: government bureaucrats, corporate lawyers, even the occasional hostile project manager. She knew that this fight would be different, messy, perhaps, but she also knew that she was ready for it. She had the truth on her side, and more importantly, she had the stubborn, unshakable resolve of a woman who had spent a lifetime pushing back against the odds. The drive back to her cabin was long and winding, the gravel road twisting through dense pine forests and along the rocky shores of the lake. As she rounded the final bend, her cabin coming into view, Emma felt a pang of homesickness for a place she had never truly left. She had spent so many years wandering, building bridges and flood barriers in far-flung corners of the world, that she had almost forgotten what it felt like to have a home, to put down roots and fight for something that truly mattered. She parked the truck and climbed out, her boots crunching over the frosted ground as she made her way up the porch steps. Whiskers, her scruffy, gray tabby cat, was waiting for her on the porch, his tail flicking back and forth in quiet irritation as he surveyed the snow-covered landscape. Emma reached down to scratch his ears, smiling as he let out a low, rumbling purr. "Don't worry, old boy," she murmured, her breath steaming in the frigid air. "We're going to win this fight. I promise." Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, the wood stove crackling softly in the corner and the faint, comforting smell of pine and old leather filling the air. Emma set her satchel down on the kitchen table and poured herself a fresh cup of coffee, the bitter, steaming liquid a welcome warmth against the chill of the morning. She spent the next few hours reviewing her notes, organizing her files, and mentally preparing herself for the coming battle. She knew that the HOA would not take her letter lightly, that they would come back with everything they had, armed with lawyers, bylaws, and the deep pockets of a well-funded organization. But Emma had no intention of backing down. She had the truth on her side, and more importantly, she had the element of surprise. 2 days later, the response came. It arrived in the form of a certified letter, the HOA's logo emblazoned in bold, blue ink on the envelope, the paper inside thick and expensive, the kind favored by law firms and corporate boards. Emma tore it open, her heart pounding with a mixture of anticipation and dread as she unfolded the neatly typed pages. The letter was exactly what she had expected, a carefully worded, vaguely threatening demand that she cease and desist her unfounded claims to the dock and surrounding property, along with a thinly veiled threat of legal action if she continued to press the issue. The language was cold, clinical, and dripping with condescension, the kind of bureaucratic doublespeak that Emma had spent a lifetime fighting against. She felt a flicker of anger rise in her chest as she read the final paragraph, where the HOA's attorney, a man named Marcus Dillard, had the audacity to suggest that Emma's claims were based on misunderstandings and outdated records, and that the association would be more than happy to negotiate a reasonable settlement if she agreed to drop her complaints and comply with their regulations. Emma set the letter down on the table, her jaw clenched, her fingers trembling with barely suppressed rage. They thought they could bully her, that they could scare her into submission with their legal jargon and thinly veiled threats. They had no idea who they were dealing with. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to calm down, to think clearly. She had spent too many years solving complex engineering problems, too many sleepless nights poring over blueprints and structural models, to let a bunch of petty bureaucrats get the better of her now. She needed a plan, a way to turn their own weapons against them, to expose the cracks in their carefully constructed facade and bring their entire house of cards crashing down around them. Over the next few days, Emma threw herself into the task with the kind of single-minded determination that had made her a legend in her field. She spent hours on the phone with the county clerk, the state land office, and the Army Corps of Engineers, digging deeper into the history of her property and the surrounding land. She pored over old survey maps, cross-referencing them with modern satellite images and tax records, searching for the tiny, overlooked details that could prove her case beyond a shadow of a doubt. And then, late one night, as she sat hunched over her cluttered kitchen table, her eyes bleary from hours of reading and her head pounding from too much coffee and too little sleep, she found it. Buried in the fine print of an old land grant, dated 1893, was the smoking gun she had been looking for, a clause that granted the original owner of her property not just the land itself, but also exclusive rights to the waterway and all associated structures, including docks, piers, and boat slips in perpetuity. Emma felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face as she leaned back in her chair, the old, yellowed paper crinkling softly in her hands. She had them. The HOA's claims to the dock were not just unfounded. They were illegal. The land and the dock were hers, not just by right of ownership, but by the very legal framework that the HOA had built their case upon. The next morning, Emma sat down at her typewriter and began drafting her response, her fingers flying over the keys as the words poured out of her like a flood breaking through a weakened dam. She outlined her rights in clear, unambiguous language, citing the original land grant, the survey maps, and the dozens of pages of supporting documents she had collected. She made it clear that any further attempts to encroach upon her property would be met with swift and decisive legal action, and that she would not hesitate to seek damages if the HOA continued their campaign of harassment. When she finished, she leaned back in her chair, her heart pounding with a fierce, quiet pride. She had done it. She had turned the tables on her enemies, had used their own weapons against them, and had come out the other side stronger and more determined than ever. As she folded the letter into its envelope and sealed it with a sharp, satisfying snap, Emma felt a deep, bone-deep sense of satisfaction settle in her chest. She had taken the first step in a long, hard fight, and she had no intention of backing down now. The Crystal Lake HOA had pushed her too far, and now they were going to pay the price. Emma dropped her latest letter to the HOA into the blue mailbox outside the general store, the heavy thunk of the metal door echoing in the crisp morning air. She watched the flag snap back into place, her breath steaming in the frigid air as a fierce, quiet satisfaction settled in her chest. She had spent weeks gathering her evidence, poring over land grants and survey maps, piecing together the story of her property like an archaeologist uncovering the bones of an ancient civilization. Now, with this final, meticulously crafted response, she had delivered the final blow, the knockout punch that she hoped would send the HOA reeling. As she climbed back into her truck and started the engine, Emma's mind drifted back to the long nights she had spent hunched over her kitchen table, her fingers stained with ink and her eyes burning from too little sleep. She had called in every favor, tapped every resource, and leaned on every connection she had made over a lifetime of bridge building and problem solving. She had dug deep into the history of Crystal Lake, tracing its ownership back to the earliest days of the American frontier, when the land had been carved out of the wilderness by men and women as tough and stubborn as the mountains themselves. It had been a grueling, exhausting process, but it had also been strangely exhilarating, a reminder of the fierce, determined woman she had once been, the engineer who had built towering steel structures and held back raging rivers with nothing but grit and a slide rule. She had found her strength again, her purpose, and she was not about to let a group of petty bureaucrats take that from her. When she reached her cabin, Emma parked the truck and climbed out, her boots crunching over the frost-covered gravel as she made her way up the porch steps. Whiskers was waiting for her, his tail flicking back and forth in quiet irritation as he surveyed the snow-covered landscape. Emma reached down to scratch his ears, smiling as he leaned into her touch, his eyes narrowing in contentment. "Don't worry, old boy," she murmured, her breath steaming in the cold air. "This will all be over soon." Inside, the cabin was warm and welcoming, the wood stove crackling softly in the corner and the faint, comforting smell of pine and old leather filling the air. Emma hung her coat on the hook by the door and set her satchel down on the kitchen table, her mind already racing with plans for the next phase of her campaign. She knew that the HOA would not take her latest letter lightly, that they would come back with everything they had, armed with lawyers, bylaws, and the deep pockets of a well-funded organization. But Emma had no intention of backing down. She had the truth on her side, and more importantly, she had the element of surprise. A week later, the first cracks in the HOA's armor began to appear. It started with a phone call from Marcus Dillard, the HOA's high-priced attorney, his voice dripping with barely concealed panic as he stammered through a hastily prepared speech about misunderstandings and oversights. Emma listened in silence as he tried to backpedal, his words tumbling over one another as he attempted to distance himself from the HOA's overreach, his tone shifting from arrogance to desperation as he realized just how badly his clients had miscalculated. When he finally ran out of steam, Emma took a deep breath, letting the silence stretch for a long, uncomfortable moment before responding. "Mr. Dillard," she said, her voice calm but edged with steel, "I suggest you advise your clients to drop this matter and focus on cleaning up their own mess. I have the original land grant, the surveys, and the legal documentation to prove my ownership of the dock and surrounding property. If the HOA continues to harass me, I will have no choice but to seek damages and pursue criminal charges for trespassing and harassment." Dillard stammered something about reviewing the documents and getting back to her, but Emma had already made up her mind. She ended the call without another word, her hand trembling slightly as she set the phone back in its cradle. She felt a slow, fierce grin spread across her face as she realized just how deeply the HOA had dug themselves into a hole, how completely they had underestimated her resolve. The following morning, Emma woke to the sound of car doors slamming and raised voices echoing up from the lakeshore. She climbed out of bed, wrapped herself in a thick wool sweater, and made her way to the window, her breath catching in her throat as she took in the scene below. A small army of men in hard hats and reflective vests had descended on the dock, their trucks and equipment scattered along the shoreline like the debris of a shipwreck. At their head was Victoria Carson, her perfectly styled blonde hair gleaming in the winter sunlight, her face a mask of barely contained rage as she barked orders to her crew. Emma felt her heart begin to race, a slow, fierce anger building in her chest as she watched the workers unload jackhammers, power saws, and heavy-duty drills from the backs of their trucks. They were preparing to dismantle the dock, to tear it down piece by piece in a desperate attempt to erase the evidence of their overreach before the law caught up with them. Without a second thought, Emma grabbed her coat and marched out the door, her boots crunching over the snow as she made her way down the winding path to the lake. She could feel the cold air biting at her cheeks, her breath steaming in the frigid air as she reached the edge of the clearing, her heart pounding with a mixture of fear and fury. "Stop!" she shouted, her voice echoing off the frozen surface of the lake. The workers froze, their heads snapping around to stare at her, their eyes wide with surprise and confusion. Victoria turned slowly, her lips curling into a thin, contemptuous smile as she took in Emma's flushed, furious face. "You have no right to be here," Victoria sneered, her voice dripping with condescension. "This dock belongs to the community, and we're removing it for safety reasons." Emma felt a fierce, bone-deep rage surge through her, her fists clenching at her sides as she took a step closer, her eyes locked on Victoria's perfectly made-up face. "This dock is mine," she growled, her voice low and dangerous. "I have the original land grant, the surveys, and the legal documentation to prove it. If you or any of your people so much as touch a single nail on this dock, I will have you arrested for trespassing and destruction of private property." For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the soft creak of the ice beneath their feet, the distant cry of a loon echoing across the frozen lake. Then, slowly, Victoria's smile faded, her eyes narrowing in barely concealed fury as she realized that she had lost, that Emma had outmaneuvered her at every turn, that the battle for the dock and the lake was over. Without another word, Victoria turned on her heel and marched back to her SUV, her heels clicking sharply against the frozen ground as she barked orders to her crew, the workers scrambling to pack up their tools and equipment as they retreated from the lakeshore like a defeated army. As Emma watched them go, her breath steaming in the cold air, she felt a deep, satisfying warmth spread through her chest. She had won. She had taken back her land, her dock, and her life, and she had done it on her own terms, with her own two hands. And as the last of the trucks disappeared down the winding gravel road, leaving nothing but tire tracks and the faint scent of diesel in their wake, Emma turned and made her way back to her cabin, her head held high and her heart full of quiet, unshakable pride.